I should have locked the door. I should have drawn the curtain. I should have done 100 things differently that evening. But I didn't. And now King Nana, the most powerful man in the kingdom, stands outside my small wooden door after midnight, watching me bathe, and my foolish heart runs faster than sense. I am Kofi, just a cook, and I am in terrible, beautiful trouble. Kofi Mensah woke before the sun, as he always did. The palace kitchen was his world, the smell of palm soup, the hiss of hot oil, the satisfaction of feeding an entire royal household without a single complaint. At 28, he was the youngest head cook the palace had ever employed, and he wore that quietly like a medal no one else could see. He was also desperately, silently, hopelessly in love with the king. Not that he would ever say it. Not that he could ever say it. King Nana Kweku Asante was 37, broad-shouldered, with a jaw carved from patience and eyes that held the weight of a whole kingdom. He was married to Queen Abena, graceful, intelligent, beloved by the people. He was untouchable in every way that mattered. Kofi had learned to love him the way you love the sun, from a distance, carefully, never staring too long. That Tuesday evening, after a long shift, Kofi slipped behind the eastern wing to the small bathing shelter the staff used when the main quarters were occupied. The evening light was golden and the compound was quiet. He had checked. No one was around. He undressed, poured the first bowl of cool water over his shoulders, and exhaled. He did not hear the footsteps. King Kweku had taken a rare evening walk, something his advisors discouraged. He turned the corner of the eastern wing, without thinking, and stopped. Kofi turned at the sound of gravel shifting underfoot. Their eyes met. The world held its breath. Kofi moved fast, reaching for his cloth, pressing it to his body, his face burning with something between shame and pure panic. He dropped to one knee instinctively, head bowed, heart hammering so loudly he was certain the king could hear it. "Your Majesty, forgive me. I did not know." "Stand up." Kweku's voice was quiet. Not cold, not angry, just quiet in a way that felt more dangerous than shouting. Kofi stood, cloth clutched tight, eyes fixed somewhere near the king's feet. He could feel the king's gaze like a hand on his skin, steady, unhurried. It lasted 3 seconds, too long to be accident. "The Eastern Walk is not restricted to staff," Kweku said finally. "You did nothing wrong." Kofi nodded, not trusting his mouth. The king didn't move. That was the strange part. Kings turned and walked away. That was what they did when encounters like this happened. They dismissed. They forgot. They moved on. But Kweku stood there in his loose evening cloth, the golden light cutting across his face, and he looked at Kofi the way a man looks when he is trying to memorize something. "What is your name?" Kweku asked. Kofi blinked. "Kofi, Your Majesty." "Head cook, I know who you are." A pause. "I asked your name." "Kofi," he repeated, softer. Kweku nodded slowly, as though the name meant something now that he'd received it properly. Then, finally, he turned and walked back the way he came. Kofi stood frozen until the footsteps disappeared entirely. Then he sat down on the bathing stool, cloth still gripped to his chest, and stared at the ground. He told himself it meant nothing. The king had simply been surprised. That long look was nothing. That almost tender voice was nothing. He repeated it until his pulse slowed. He did not believe a single word. 3 days passed. Kofi cooked and served and moved through the palace like a ghost wearing a calm face. He told no one. There was nothing to tell. The king had looked at him. That was all. On the 4th day, the king requested his evening meal be brought to his private reading room rather than the dining hall. This was not unusual. What was unusual was the instruction that followed. The head cook should bring it personally. Kofi stood in the kitchen reading the note twice. Ama. His young kitchen assistant looked over his shoulder and grinned. "The king likes your cooking." "The king eats my cooking every day," Kofi said, folding the note. "He has never asked me to bring it. He went anyway. What else could he do?" The private reading room smelled of old paper and cedar. Kweku was standing at the window when Kofi entered, hands clasped behind his back, looking out at the courtyard below. Kofi set the tray down carefully. Pepper soup, soft kinky, garden eggs, and a clay pot. Your Majesty. Your evening meal. Sit. Kofi looked at the empty chair like it was a trap. It would not be appropriate. I am not asking you to share the meal. Kweku turned from the window. I am asking you to sit. There is a difference. Kofi sat. Kweku returned to his chair, lifted the clay pot lid, and breathed in the steam. A small, real smile crossed his face, the kind Kofi had only ever seen from across a crowded hall. I have eaten in 4 different countries, Kweku said. No one makes pepper soup the way you do. My grandmother taught me, Kofi said. She believed a soup should feel like something, like it has intention. Kweku looked at him. And what is the intention tonight? Kofi's throat tightened. Warmth, he said quietly. Just warmth. The king held his gaze 1 beat too long, then looked down at his bowl. Then it is perfect, he said. Kofi walked back to the kitchen afterwards and said nothing to anyone. But his hands were shaking, and not from the weight of the tray. It started as a knock, a gentle one, almost hesitant, against Kofi's small staff quarters door at 10:30 on a Thursday night. Kofi sat up from his mat, heart immediately awake in a way his body wasn't. He opened the door. King Kweku stood in plain dark cloth, no guards, no attendants. Just a man at a door, looking slightly uncertain, which on a king's face looked almost impossible and completely disarming. I couldn't sleep, Kweku said. It was perhaps the least royal excuse Kofi had ever heard. He stared. May I come in? Kweku added. Kofi stepped aside. The room was modest. A mat, a small table, a stool, a window. No decoration fit for a king. But Kweku sat on the wooden stool without complaint and looked around slowly, like the simplicity of the space was itself interesting. Do you not have counselors to talk to? Kofi asked carefully, wrapping a cloth around his shoulders. They give me answers, Kweku said. I wanted conversation. They talked for an hour. About food, about childhood, about the weight of inherited roles. Kweku spoke about his father's expectations, with a weariness he clearly kept locked away in daylight. Kofi told him about growing up in the village, cooking for his siblings when his mother worked nights. At some point, the distance between them on the small mat they both moved. It felt like a deliberate thing, like both men were, aware of exactly how much space remained and choosing not to close it. Before he left, Kweku stood at the door and looked at Kofi the way he had beside the bathing shelter. That steady, memorizing look. Thank you, he said. Just at that, Kofi nodded and closed the door gently. He sat back on his mat and pressed his palms flat against his knees. The handsome king had come to his door. And somewhere deep in Kofi's chest, something that had been sleeping for a very long time opened its eyes. Kofi began to dread the nights, not because he didn't want them, but because he wanted them too much. Kweku came back. Not every night at first, but often enough that Kofi's body began to listen for footsteps after the palace quieted. They talked in low voices. They laughed quietly, carefully, like men who had found something precious and knew it could break. Some nights they said almost nothing, just sat close, sharing the silence the way you only can with someone safe. But Kofi knew better than to call it safe. One night, Kweku reached over and adjusted the cloth, slipping off Kofi's shoulder. A small thing, a nothing thing, except his hand lingered a half-second past what fixing a cloth required. Fingers warm against Kofi's collarbone, and neither man pretended they hadn't noticed. Kofi stood abruptly. Put space between them. This isn't right, he said, voice low and strained. Kweku looked at him calmly. No, he agreed. It isn't. You are the king. You have a queen. I am your cook. Kofi pressed his fingers to his forehead. This cannot become what it is becoming. And what is it becoming? Kweku asked quietly. Kofi looked at him, at this man who carried a kingdom on his shoulders, and showed up at a cook's door because he couldn't sleep and felt something in his chest fracture quietly. Something neither of us can afford, Kofi whispered. Kwaku rose slowly. The way he did everything, with a measured, heavy grace. He stopped in front of Kofi, close but not touching. I have spent 17 years being exactly what everyone needed me to be, he said. I have never once asked for what I needed. The words landed soft and devastating. Kofi said nothing. What was there to say to a confession that mirrored his own hidden life so precisely? Kwaku left without touching him again. But the air in the room after he was gone felt charged, like the space between lightning and thunder. Kofi sat alone and tried very hard not to hope. He was not entirely successful. They found a place, a bench beneath the old mango tree in the far end of the palace garden, past the herb plots, past the yam storage where the groundskeepers rarely went after dark. It became theirs without anyone naming it that. They went separately, always 10 minutes apart. They left separately, too. It was a careful choreography, practiced and precise, but careful people still make mistakes. The first kiss happened on a Wednesday. Kofi still didn't know who moved first, only that the conversation had grown quiet and the night had grown warm, and when he turned his head, Kwaku was already there, close and still and looking at him like a question he'd been holding for weeks. It was brief, tentative, the softest collision of two lives that had no business touching. When they separated, they both sat very still, staring at the dark garden. Kofi's heart was a drumline. Kwaku exhaled like a man setting down something very heavy. "Kofi," he said softly. "Don't," Kofi replied. Not unkindly. "Just don't name it yet. Let it exist 1 minute without needing to be explained." So they sat under the mango tree and let it be what it was. A secret, a wonder, a wait. The nights that followed were warmer. A hand held in the dark, foreheads pressed together, quiet words exchanged in the space where royalty and simplicity had no meaning. Just two men, discovering that longing given language becomes terrifying and beautiful at once. Kwaku traced a line of Kofi's jaw one evening with 2 fingers, something reverent in the gesture, and said, "I did not know I could feel this." Kofi caught his hand gently, held it. "Neither did I." They didn't hear the soft crunch of footsteps on the far path. They didn't see the shadow pause behind the hibiscus hedge. They didn't know that someone else now held what they had tried so carefully to keep. The mango tree had witnessed. So had someone else. Her name was Akosua. She had served Queen Abena for 11 years. She was loyal the way old wood is loyal, quietly, stubbornly, without question. She went to the queen the very next morning. Abena Serwa was at her vanity when Akosua entered, braiding her hair with the slow, practiced patience of a woman who had learned to move through life without hurry. She watched Akosua's reflection in the mirror, the tight jaw, the lowered eyes. "Say it plainly," the queen said. Akosua said it plainly. The room went quiet. Not with shock. The queen's face didn't fracture the way a surprised person's would. It settled, like something long braced for had finally arrived. "Under the mango tree?" Abena asked. "Yes, your majesty." "The cook?" "Kofi Mensa." "Yes." Abena dismissed her gently, kindly, the way she did everything. When the door closed, she sat for a long moment, hands folded in her lap, looking at her own reflection. She was not a cruel woman. She was not even, she realized, a deeply wounded one. What she felt was something quieter and sadder, the ache of a woman who had shared 17 years with a man she respected but could never truly reach. She had told herself the distance was his nature. Now she understood it was a door he had kept locked, not from her because of cruelty, but because he had kept it locked even from himself. She rose, straightened her cloth with dignified hands, and walked to the king's chamber. He was reading. He looked up when she entered, and something shifted behind his eyes. Not guilt, exactly. Something older. Something tired and cornered and afraid. Abena sat across from him and folded her hands. "We need to speak," she said, "about Kofi." The king set his book down. He didn't ask how she knew. He didn't deny it. He simply looked at his wife, and for the first time in 17 years they were completely honest with each other. Kwaku had faced councils, droughts, border disputes, and the deaths of people he loved. None of it had unmade him the way this conversation did. Abena was not screaming. That was somehow worse. She spoke with the careful steadiness of someone who had decided in the moments before entering the room to remain whole. "How long?" she asked. "Not long," Kwaku said. "Nothing. We haven't." He stopped. "It has been weeks. The feeling's longer." "The feeling's longer," she repeated. Not mocking, confirming. "How much longer, Kwaku?" He looked at his hands. "Always," he said. "In one way or another. Always." Abena closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, they were clear. "Does he love you?" The question surprised him. He considered it honestly. "I think so, yes. And you?" He didn't answer immediately, which was itself an answer. "Then, yes." Abena stood and walked to the window. Outside the palace grounds were ordinary guards at their posts, birds in the frangipani, 2 children of a palace official, chasing a dog across the path. Everything as it should be. Nothing as it was. "I have been a good queen," she said. "Not a boast. A quiet statement of fact." "You have been an extraordinary queen," Kwaku said, and he meant it deeply. "None of this is your failure." "None of it. I know," she said. "I also know that if this becomes public, it destroys everything. Your legacy, the court's trust, the people's faith." She turned. "And I know that you know this too." Kwaku said nothing. What was there to say? "Kofi cannot stay," Abena said. The words landed like stone. "Abena. He leaves quietly, with dignity, and with provisions, or this is handled publicly, and he is disgraced." Her voice was not cruel. It was the voice of a queen doing the hardest calculus of her reign. "I will give him the choice, but he cannot stay." Kwaku sat in his chair long after she left, and for the first time in 37 years the king wept. Queen Abena came to Kofi herself. No guards, no announcement. Kofi was in the kitchen when Adwoa, a kitchen girl, whispered that the queen was at the back door, and Kofi's blood went to ice. He walked out to meet her with flour still on his hands, which he realized too late and rubbed against his apron uselessly. Abena looked at him, truly looked at him, and Kofi understood in that moment why the king had married her. There was no smallness in her. Even delivering something devastating, she was somehow kind. "I am not here to shame you," she said. "I need you to hear me with clear ears." He listened. She laid it out, simply. Leave tonight, quietly, with a parcel of money that would set him up far from the capital. Or remain, be formally removed, the matter made public. His name a scandal, his family marked by it. Kofi stared at the ground between them for a long time. "Does he know you are here?" he asked. "He knows the outcome," she said. "Not this conversation." Kofi nodded slowly. Something in him had known this was coming, had known from the very first knock on his door that there was no version of this story where he stayed. Men like him did not get to keep kings. That was not how the world was written. "I'll leave tonight," he said quietly. Abena was quiet for a moment. "Then, he loves you. I want you to know that I saw it clearly. What you are is not a small thing." She paused. "It is simply an impossible one." Kofi pressed his lips together hard. He would not cry in front of the queen. "I know," he managed. She left him a wrapped parcel. She did not look back. Kofi stood in the kitchen where he had cooked 1,000 meals, looked at the fires he had lit and tended and built, and quietly began to gather the only things that were truly his.
Kofi left before midnight. He did not say goodbye to anyone. He could not trust his face with it. He carried one bag, a change of cloth, his grandmother's wooden spoon, the parcel the queen had given him. He walked through the eastern gate the way he had come in 3 years ago, unremarkable, unhurried, a young man with a trade and nowhere particular to belong. He did not look back at the palace. If he had, he would have seen the light in the private reading room still burning. Kweku stood at that window. He had been standing there since the hour when he knew Kofi would be leaving. He couldn't go to him, couldn't make it harder, couldn't make a promise he was not free to keep. All he could do was stand and watch the gate and breathe through the kind of pain that has no name in any language he'd been taught. He stayed at the window until the light changed. In the kitchen the next morning, a new cook was assigned. They were competent. The food was fine. The king ate without comment, and no one noticed that he barely tasted anything. Abena watched her husband across the breakfast table, the absence behind his eyes, the set of his jaw that was holding something in. She had done what she had to do. She did not regret the decision. She did, however, grieve for all three of them in the quiet way she grieved most things. Privately, completely, alone. Kofi, on the road heading north, stopped once at a wayside stall and ate wache from a banana leaf. It was ordinary. He thought about how he had cooked for a king. How a king had come to his door. How under a mango tree, in the dark, he had been held by someone powerful enough to hold the world, and that man had held him gently. He would build a life. He would cook again. He would be fine. But he would never be untouched by it. The love of a king, even a brief one, even a secret one, leaves a mark that does not fade. And in a palace behind him, a handsome king sat on a throne and quietly agreed.
Thank you for watching. Some love stories don't end with forever. Some end with a quiet gate, a single bag and a wooden spoon carried from a life that almost was. Kofi and Kweku never got their ending, but what they had was real, stolen, brief, and beautiful in the way only impossible things can be. This story is for everyone who has ever loved someone they couldn't keep. Everyone who has chosen silence to protect something larger than themselves. And everyone who knows that love doesn't require a happy ending to have been worth every single moment. The handsome king saw him Betty, and nothing was ever the same again for either of them. If this story moved you, please do well to subscribe, like, and share. Also, you can join the membership for exclusive stories, early access, and content you won't find anywhere. Your support keeps the stories alive.